What's your view? Do you think big business have their role to play in encouraging vaccine take-up?
I do. I'm not entirely sure that mocking people for not getting the vaccine is the way to do that. I mean, I think that
Mm.
people who are kind of vocally anti-vax are completely wrong and doing something very dangerous and irresponsible and frankly very selfish. But I don't think that's the way. The way to persuade most people who aren't getting vaccinated is not to mock them or make them feel like they're being left out. Most people who are not getting vaccinated aren't doing it. Most people kind of over the age of whatever the age is now
Vulnerable
that you have to.
groups, yeah.
Exactly. The people who are old enough to be getting the vaccine who aren't generally are not doing so because of things like, you know, they've had negative experiences with healthcare professionals and their pharmacist hasn't had time to call them yet and try to persuade them. Because that's what people respond really well to. It's medical professionals that they've got long-term, really positive relationships with, giving them a call, encouraging them, reminding them that it's safe, telling them, like, I've always been there for you. I've always tried to make you healthy as possible. You can trust me on this one. The other reason that people aren't getting vaccinated is because they've got really difficult, really busy, really stressful lives. And the only place to get vaccinated is like across town. They've got to pay a few quid for the bus to get there. These are the kinds of things that we
Mm.
need to be dealing with to get as many people vaccinated as possible. Mocking people or making them feel like they're going to be left out because they haven't drunk Heineken or whatever the hell it is. That's not the way to persuade people.
But, Big Rich, is it really the role of corporations to enforce that message? I understand that the government want us to have the vaccine, and therefore, if the Department of Health used their marketing budget to get that message across, that feels pretty clear cut to me. No conflict of interest. But is it really the job of a beer giant to decide what goes into our body?
I mean, freedom of speech, I guess, is the answer to that, right? I mean, I can't say I'm particularly interested in what Heineken has got to say, but I think there's quite a very long-term tradition in our society of private companies and private organisations, making interventions in our politics and in our culture, and I think they've got the right to do that. I think what is really striking about this is that a brand like Heineken doesn't make this kind of intervention unless they're absolutely certain they've got the public on their side.
Uh,
So they're
yeah.
wagering people agree with them.
Olivia, I'm reluctant to criticise Heineken because I'll be investing heavily in their product on Sunday. But what do you think about the precedent of a business, a commercial organisation, getting involved in medical messaging?
Um, I agree with quite a lot of what Richard says. I don't particularly think it's appropriate, really. I mean, it's just very cheap, is what it seems to me. As
Is it
as Richard
virtue,
said, they sort of
Utley?
know that.
Utley, is it virtue signalling?
Yeah, it is. It's obvious virtue signaling. And as Richard says, they sort of know that they're going to have the majority of the public on side. It's easy to do. It doesn't cost them anything.
Mm.
And it'll get people talking about them. And the people who buy Heineken are probably people, because most people are, who have been vaccinated. So then it doesn't cost them anything. They're not really going to persuade anyone. It's a bit like putting a black box on Instagram. It sort of says nothing. I don't feel particularly
What's a black
upset
box on
from a
Instagram? Sorry, I'm
Oh,
47. What does that
when
mean?
Black
Could you
Lives Matter was
translate?
at its height,
What?
when Black Lives Matter was at its height,
Oh, I
there were
see.
people who, as their sort of, I care about Black Lives Matter.
Oh,
They'd
I
just
see. Okay.
upload a picture of a black box on Instagram. And it's completely meaningless and obviously totally pointless, but it shows people that, that they're the right kind of person. And I
Yeah.
think that's exactly what Heineken's doing with this. It's just cheap, in my opinion, but I don't think it's massively harmful having
Is it?
a
I mean, is it?
corporate.
Yeah, I wonder whether it crosses a line, though, ethically, Olivia. I'm pro vaccine. I've had both vaccine doses, but, there is some concern about, the over 12s having the vaccine. I've spoken to various medics on this program who think that the small risk that's associated with any vaccine means actually it's not a good idea for small children. So, if you're running a company that's there to sell beer, do you want to sort of enter that quagmire, that moral quagmire?
Yeah, I think it's really odd, and I think the sort of way that they've done it by mocking people who don't want the vaccine. It's very strange. I think we've got this weird culture going on where you're not allowed to ask questions. And, I'm pro-vax. I've got my first one. I'll get my second when I'm called up to do it. But I think it's very strange that we've got into this habit of sort of just calling people stupid and wrong. And as you say, the children element is really important, and it's quite a nuanced argument. And it does feel, because we found out now that only 25 children have died in the last year of COVID. So the risk of taking the vaccine has to be very, 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 very small for it to be worth children having the vaccine, because they're not really at risk from the disease. And that's quite a kind of nuanced little thing, isn't it? And like Heineken just sort of stomping in there with both feet, saying the very obvious, cheapest, lowest hanging fruit thing to say, doesn't really seem appropriate.
And also, it's hypocrisy, isn't it, Richard? I mean, I like Heineken, but consuming Heineken is hardly a sort of public health measure in its own right, is it?
That is absolutely true. I mean, I think this is the standard issue hypocrisy of advertising and capitalism. The kind of fact that we've got to see Coca-Cola bottles and Heineken in front of all of our favourite players in the Euros, and it's just, wait, is it the Euros or is it Wimbledon? I can't remember. At the moment, we're seeing it a lot in the sports stories on the news, and it's absolutely bizarre. These people obviously should not be advertising next to sports people, because it does give the impression that somehow their product isn't incredibly unhealthy, which it is. Just on this point about children being vaccinated, obviously, families have the right to make that decision, and I think it's right that they continue to have that right. But anyone who's listening to this who is a bit concerned about children getting vaccinated, what I would say is, firstly, all the evidence does suggest that the dangers of the vaccine are infinitesimally small, and that whilst, yes, COVID is very unlikely to kill children, there's a very significant extra chunk, albeit a small one, of children who have, ended up hospitalized. Like, that is a significantly larger number. Any doctor, any hospital doctor in the country will tell you that there have been quite a lot of children hospitalized, albeit, across the population, a small number. That is obviously something that people really want to avoid. Also, people really need to remember that we already vaccinate children, including small children, against loads of things, including flu.
Of course, but with long-established vaccines, Richard, not vaccines that are still at the trial stage.
So that's not actually true. Every year, the flu vaccine is a different vaccine. Yeah, it's a completely new vaccine.
It's a tweak, isn't it?
Every year. So something to bear in mind is that we already do vaccinate children with, what are effectively experimental vaccines. And that's because actually we're very confident about how vaccines work, and therefore we know it's safe, and it's never worked out badly before. And the reason that we vaccinate children against flu is not because they are likely to be hurt by the flu. It's because their granny and their grandpa and their teachers.
The children are quite likely to get seriously ill with flu, whereas they're not with COVID.
Yeah, Olivia, let's talk about that, because I'm just online at the moment, and the newswires are carrying this story that the overall risk of children becoming severely ill or dying from COVID is extremely low. Data from the first 12 months of the pandemic in England shows 25 under 18s died from COVID. Those living with multiple chronic illnesses and neuro disabilities were most at risk, though overall risk remains low. So why have you opened this can of worms of jabbing kids that don't need it? I mean, ultimately, Richard, if one healthy child dies, that's one too many.
Well, that's absolutely true. That's one too many. But as I said, there are, firstly, any danger to children from the vaccine is infinitesimally small. They're very confident.
But why? But Big Rich, why? Why vaccinate children if they face no mortal threat from COVID? What's the plan? Are they going to be the foot soldiers in this pandemic?
So the reason to do it is exactly the same that we vaccinate them against flu.
Well, no, because flu kills many more children. And what I've got to do is let Olivia have the last word. Rich, keep it brief if you can. Keep it brief.
Okay, the reason to do it is that they can be hurt even if they're not killed by it. And it's because we want children to protect their grannies and their grandpas and little children around them who can be hurt by it.
It's not children's job to protect older generations, and I certainly don't want smaller children protecting me. But Rich, I respect your view, and I know it's a view shared by many, including the Shadow Schools Minister, Peter Kyle, who spoke to me a week ago on this show. Olivia, last word briefly, if you can.
I absolutely agree that, there is this argument, which, like you, Mark, I disagree with, that children should be helping to protect their grannies. But I happen to disagree with that. But the comparison with flu is just totally false. Flu affects vulnerable people, both old and young. It affects young children whose immune systems are badly damaged, and it affects old people. COVID specifically affects old people, but not young children. So it's just a false comparison with flu. I mean, you can make the other argument, fair enough. I disagree with it, but you can make it. But I don't think the comparison with flu really holds water at all.
My sincere thanks to both of you. Really brilliant panel today. Olivia Utley is the assistant comment editor at The Telegraph. Richard Power Sayeed, former Labour advisor.